The morning sun painted the Arizona sky orange and pink as Thomas Walker stepped onto his wooden porch. His boots creaked against the old planks as he stretched his tired back. At 43 years old, Thomas looked older than his age. Deep lines marked his face from squinting against the desert sun for 20 long years. His ranch stretched out before him like a sea of brown grass and red dirt. 2,000 acres of land that he had built with his own two hands. The cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, black dots against the endless horizon. This was his world now. Just him, his animals, and the silence that filled every corner of his days. Thomas picked up his coffee mug from the porch rail. The metal was still warm from the morning brew. He took a slow sip and let the bitter taste wake him up completely. This was how every day started for him. Same time, same coffee, same view. It had been this way for 7 years now. 7 years since he had lost everything that mattered. His wife Rebecca had been the light of his world. She had laughed at his terrible jokes and made their small ranch house feel like a palace. When she got pregnant, Thomas thought his life was perfect. He had started building a crib with his own hands, carving little horses into the wood. He had dreamed of teaching his son how to ride, how to work the land, how to be a good man. But life had other plans. Rebecca died during childbirth on a cold winter night. The baby boy never took his first breath. In one terrible night, Thomas lost his wife, his son, and his faith and happiness. The doctor from town had done everything he could, but sometimes medicine wasn't enough. Sometimes life just took what it wanted and left you standing in the ruins. The people in Prescott, the nearest town 20 miles away, had tried to help at first. They brought him food, invited him to church dinners, and even tried to introduce him to other women who had lost their husbands. But Thomas wasn't interested. His heart felt like a dried-up well with nothing left to give. Mrs. Henderson from the general store had been especially persistent. She would always mention her cousin visiting from back east, or the new schoolteacher who seemed very nice. Thomas would just nod politely and change the subject to cattle prices or the weather. After 2 years of gentle pushing, even she had given up trying. His ranch hands respected his privacy. Miguel and Carlos, 2 Mexican brothers who had worked for him since the beginning, understood grief. They had lost family, too. They worked hard during the day and left him alone in the evenings. Sometimes Thomas would hear them talking and laughing around their own campfire near the bunkhouse, but he never joined them. Their joy felt too distant from his world. The only visitors Thomas ever got were cattle buyers from the bigger ranches and occasionally some drifter looking for work. He treated everyone fairly, paid good wages, and never turned away someone who was truly hungry. But he kept his heart locked away like precious gold in a safe. At night, Thomas would sit on his porch with a glass of whiskey and watch the stars come out. The desert nights were quiet except for the sound of coyotes howling in the distance and the gentle lowing of his cattle. Sometimes he would talk to Rebecca as if she was still there beside him, telling her about his day or asking her opinion about ranch business. But the wind was the only thing that answered back. The house felt too big and too empty. Rebecca had decorated it with curtains she sewed herself and wildflowers she picked from the meadow near the creek. After she died, Thomas had taken down the curtains and let the flowers wilt. He kept only the bare necessities: a bed, a table, a chair, and her photograph on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. In that photograph, Rebecca was smiling and holding a bouquet of desert flowers. Her eyes sparkled with the happiness of a new bride. Thomas would look at it every morning and every night, remembering what it felt like to love someone completely. But those feelings seemed as distant as the mountains on the horizon. The ranch itself was doing well. Thomas was a smart businessman and a hard worker. His cattle were healthy, his land was productive, and he had money in the bank. But success felt hollow when there was no one to share it with. He had built something good, but for what? Who would inherit it when he was gone? What was the point of working so hard when he would die alone? Sometimes Thomas wondered if this was all there was left for him. Work until his body gave out, drink whiskey until the pain dulled, and wait for death to reunite him with his family. Love felt like something from another lifetime, something that had happened to a different man in a different world. The townspeople had stopped trying to matchmake for him, but they still watched him with pity in their eyes when he came to town for supplies. The poor widower who couldn't move on, the hermit rancher who had given up on life. He could see it in their faces, and it made him shop quickly and leave even faster. But Thomas had convinced himself that this was enough. He had his work, his land, and his memories. Some men were meant to love once and then spend the rest of their lives honoring that love through solitude. He had made peace with his loneliness, or at least he told himself he had. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Thomas finished his coffee and prepared for another day of the same routine. Check the cattle, mend fences, review the books, eat dinner alone, drink whiskey on the porch, and go to bed in an empty house. Tomorrow would be exactly the same, and the day after that, and every day until his time was up. He had no way of knowing that his carefully ordered, lonely world was about to change forever. That very soon, 6 strangers would ride across his land and offer him something he thought was buried forever in the desert soil of his heart. Thomas Walker believed his story was over, but in truth it was just beginning. The Tuesday afternoon sun was brutal, even for July in Arizona. Thomas was fixing a broken fence post when he saw something that made him stop and stare. A cloud of dust was rising from the eastern trail, moving slowly but steadily toward his ranch. In 20 years of living out here, unexpected visitors always meant one of 3 things: trouble, business, or bad news. He straightened up and wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. His rifle was leaning against a fence post just 3 feet away. Out here, you never knew what might come riding over the hill. Bandits, cattle rustlers, or desperate men running from the law all use these remote trails to avoid the main roads. But as the dust cloud got closer, Thomas realized these weren't the kind of visitors he was expecting. 6 riders on horseback were approaching, but something was different about them. Their posture was upright but not threatening. They rode in a loose line, not like men preparing for a fight. When they got close enough for Thomas to see clearly, his jaw dropped open in surprise. All 6 riders were women, native women, from the look of their clothing and the way they sat their horses. Apache, most likely, based on the style of their hair and the beadwork he could see on their clothes. Thomas felt his hand move toward his rifle without thinking. The Apache Wars had been brutal in this territory. Stories of raids and killings were still fresh in everyone's memory. But something made him stop. These women weren't riding like warriors. They weren't carrying weapons that he could see. And there was something about the way the older woman in front held herself that suggested they came in peace. The lead rider was a woman with silver streaks in her long black hair. Her face was weathered by sun and time, but her dark eyes were sharp and intelligent. She raised her hand in a gesture of greeting when she was still 50 yards away. That was the universal sign that they meant no harm. Thomas picked up his rifle but held it low, not pointing it at anyone. He walked toward them slowly, his boots crunching on the dry grass. His heart was beating fast, not from fear exactly, but from the strangeness of the situation. In all his years on the ranch, nothing like this had ever happened. The older woman spoke first, and her voice was calm and clear. "You are Thomas Walker?" she asked in English that was mixed with a Spanish accent. "The rancher who treats his workers with fairness?" Thomas nodded, surprised that she knew his name. "I am. Who's asking?" The woman gestured to herself and then to the others. "I am Luna. These are my daughters and nieces. We have traveled far to speak with you." Thomas looked at the other 5 women more carefully. They ranged in age from very young to about 30. Each one was sitting her horse with the easy confidence of someone who had been riding since childhood. Their clothes were dusty from travel but well made. These weren't desperate refugees or random wanderers. "Speak with me about what?" Thomas asked, still holding his rifle but feeling less threatened by the moment. Luna dismounted from her horse with fluid grace despite her age. The others followed her lead. Up close, Thomas could see that they were all beautiful in their own ways. But more importantly, they all had the bearing of intelligent, capable women. This wasn't what he had expected at all. "We have heard stories about you," Luna continued. "Stories that say you are a good man, that you pay your workers well and never cheat anyone, that you help people who are truly in need." Thomas frowned. "Who told you these stories?" "Word travels far in the desert. Mexican workers speak of you in the cantinas. Traders mention your fairness. Even some of our own people who have worked for you have good things to say." Thomas was puzzled. He had hired Apache workers before, usually for short jobs during roundup time. But he had never thought much about what they said about him afterward. Luna stepped closer, and Thomas could see the lines around her eyes that spoke of many years of hardship. "We need sanctuary," she said simply. "Our small band has been displaced from our traditional lands. We have nowhere else to go." "The reservation," Thomas started, but Luna shook her head. The reservation is no place for us. Too many people, too little food, too much sickness. We would rather take our chances in the wilderness. Thomas understood. The government reservations were often overcrowded and poorly supplied. Many native families struggled to survive there. But we are not here to ask for charity, Luna continued. We offer something in return. Thomas waited, curious about what they could possibly offer him. Luna gestured to the 5 younger women. Each of these women is skilled and strong. Each one would be honored to become your wife, to help you run this ranch, to give you the family you lost. Thomas felt like someone had hit him in the chest with a hammer. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Of all the things he might have expected to hear today, this was not even on the list. What? He finally managed to say. The youngest of the women, who couldn't have been more than 18, spoke up in careful English. We know about your wife who died. We know you have been alone for many years. A man should not be alone. Another woman, this one closer to 30 with kind eyes, added, We each have skills that would be useful here. We are not asking for easy life. We want to work to build something good. Thomas felt dizzy. He set his rifle down and took off his hat, running his hands through his hair. Ladies, I don't know what to say. This is not how these things usually work. Luna smiled for the first time since they had arrived. Nothing about our situation is usual. We are not usual women living in usual times. We need protection and a place to belong. You need companionship and help with your ranch. Perhaps we can help each other. Thomas looked around at his empty land, his quiet house, his solitary life. For 7 years he had convinced himself that this loneliness was his fate. Now 6 women were offering to change everything, and he had no idea how to respond. Do you mind if I think about this? Thomas asked, feeling foolish even as he said it. Luna nodded. Of course. This is a big decision. We will make camp by your creek tonight if you permit it. Tomorrow we can talk more. Thomas nodded slowly. Yes, that would be fine. There's good water there and shelter from the wind. As the women began to unpack their belongings and set up a temporary camp, Thomas walked back toward his house in a daze. His quiet, predictable world had just been turned completely upside down. 6 Apache women wanted to marry him. It was the most impossible, unexpected, and terrifying thing that had ever happened to him. But as he watched them work together to make their camp, moving with efficiency and care, Thomas felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't felt in 7 long years. It was small and fragile, like a tiny flame in the darkness. It was hope. Thomas spent that first night pacing around his house like a caged animal. Every few minutes he would look out his window toward the creek where the women had made their camp. He could see the orange glow of their fire and occasionally hear the soft sound of their voices carried on the evening breeze. What had just happened to his life? This morning he was a simple rancher with a predictable routine. Now 6 Apache women were camped on his land and they wanted to marry him. All of them. It was like something out of a fever dream. He poured himself a whiskey and sat in his usual chair on the porch, but nothing felt usual anymore. His mind was spinning with questions and doubts. What would the people in town say? What would his ranch hands think? Was this even legal? And most importantly, what did he actually want to do? Thomas had always considered himself a fair man when it came to different races and cultures. He paid his Mexican workers the same wages as anyone else, and he had never cheated an Apache trader or worker. But having them as employees was different from having them as wives. The very word made him uncomfortable. He had grown up hearing stories about Apache raids, about families killed and cattle stolen. The newspapers were full of accounts of savage Indians who couldn't be trusted. But the women by his creek didn't seem savage at all. They had been polite, well-spoken, and respectful. Luna especially had impressed him with her dignity and intelligence. Still, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something way over his head. Marriage was complicated enough when both people came from the same background. What would it be like to marry someone from a completely different culture? Someone who might have different beliefs, different customs, different expectations? The next morning, Thomas was up before dawn as usual, but he felt like he hadn't slept at all. He made his coffee and walked out to check on his cattle, trying to stick to his normal routine. But everything felt different now. The landscape looked the same, but his world had changed completely. When he returned to the house around mid-morning, he found the 6 women waiting for him near his porch. They had cleaned up from their journey and looked even more impressive in the daylight. Each woman was beautiful in her own way, but what struck Thomas most was how capable they all appeared. "Good morning," Luna said with a slight bow of her head. "We hope you slept well." Thomas almost laughed. "I didn't sleep much, to be honest. This is all pretty overwhelming." The youngest woman, who had introduced herself as Rosa the night before, stepped forward. She was carrying something in her hands. "Perhaps this will help you understand us better," she said, offering him a beautifully woven blanket. Thomas took the blanket and examined it closely. The craftsmanship was incredible. The patterns were complex and colorful, and the weaving was so tight and even that it must have taken months to complete. "You made this?" he asked Rosa. She nodded proudly. "I have been weaving since I was a child. I can make blankets, rugs, clothing, anything you need for the house." Another woman, who looked to be about 25 with gentle eyes, spoke up. "I am Maria. I know the healing plants that grow in this desert. I can cure many illnesses and pains with natural medicines." A third woman, taller and more athletic than the others, said, "I am Elena. I can track animals better than most men. I can find your lost cattle and protect your herd from predators." The fourth woman, with a bright smile and calloused hands, introduced herself as Carmen. "I can train horses. Your animals would be faster and stronger under my care." The fifth woman, who appeared to be the most serious of the group, said quietly, "I am Sophia. I can predict the weather by reading the signs in nature. I can help you prepare for storms and droughts." Thomas looked at each woman in turn, then at Luna. "These are impressive skills," he admitted. "But I still don't understand why you're offering to marry me. You don't even know me." Luna smiled sadly. "We know more than you think. We have been watching this ranch for months, learning about the man who lives here." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "Watching me?" "Not spying," Luna quickly clarified, "but observing. We talked to the Mexican workers who have worked for you. We spoke with the traders who have done business with you. We even asked questions in town very carefully." "What did you learn?" Thomas asked, not sure he wanted to know the answer. Elena, the tracker, spoke up. "We learned that you are honest in your business dealings, that you never cheat anyone even when you could get away with it." Carmen added, "We learned that you pay fair wages and never abuse your workers, that you have helped people who were hungry or in trouble, even when it cost you money." Sophia, the serious one, said, "We learned that you loved your wife deeply and that you have been faithful to her memory for 7 years. A man who can love like that is worth knowing." Thomas felt his cheeks burning with embarrassment and something else he couldn't quite identify. Pride, maybe. It was strange to hear his life described by these women who were essentially strangers. "But we also learned that you are dying inside," Maria, the healer, said gently. "Grief is a sickness too. We can see it in your eyes and the way you hold your shoulders. You are a good man who has forgotten how to live." Thomas wanted to argue with her, but he couldn't. She was right, and somehow that made him angry and grateful at the same time. "Even if all of that is true," Thomas said, "I still don't understand why 6 women would want to share one husband. That's not how things work in my world." Luna nodded. "It is not how things work in our world either, traditionally. But these are not traditional times. We are not in our traditional place. We must adapt or we will not survive." She gestured toward her companions. "These women are my family. Some are my daughters, some are my nieces. We have been together through many hardships. We do not want to be separated. The reservation would scatter us to different families, different places. Here we could stay together and build something new." Rosa, the weaver, added, "And we believe that a house with many women is stronger than a house with just one. We each have different skills, different strengths. Together we could make this ranch into something special." Thomas looked around at his property with new eyes. It was successful, but it was also lonely and somewhat neglected. The house needed repairs, the corrals could be improved, and there were 100 small projects he had been putting off because he just didn't have the energy to care. But what about love? Thomas asked, feeling foolish for even bringing it up. "Marriage should be about love, not just practical arrangements." Luna smiled warmly. "Love can grow, Thomas Walker. It does not always come first. Sometimes it comes after respect, after trust, after working together toward common goals." Maria stepped closer. "We are not asking you to love us all immediately. We are asking you to give us a chance to earn your affection, and to give yourself a chance to feel alive again." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, looking at each woman in turn. They were all watching him with hopeful but patient expressions. They weren't pressuring him or trying to seduce him. They were simply making an offer and waiting for his answer. But before he could respond, he heard the sound of horses approaching from the direction of town. A lot of horses moving fast. Thomas felt his stomach drop. Word had gotten out somehow, and now there was going to be trouble. The dust cloud on the horizon was getting bigger, and Thomas could make out at least a dozen riders heading straight for his ranch. The women saw them too and moved closer together instinctively. "It seems," Luna said calmly, "that our conversation will have to wait. Your neighbors are coming to visit." Thomas grabbed his rifle from where he had left it, leaning against the porch. He had a feeling this was going to be a very long day, and it was just getting started. The riders from town turned out to be led by Sheriff Martinez, a decent man who had always been fair in his dealings with Thomas. But the men with him looked angry and suspicious. Thomas recognized most of them: storekeepers, ranchers, and a few troublemakers who were always looking for reasons to cause problems. "Morning, Thomas," Sheriff Martinez called out as he dismounted. "We heard you got some visitors. Thought we'd come check on things." Thomas kept his rifle ready but pointed at the ground. "Everything's fine here, Sheriff. Just some travelers passing through." One of the other men, a rancher named Bill Crawford, who had never liked Thomas much anyway, spat into the dirt. "Travelers don't camp on a man's land for days. And these ain't just any travelers. These are Apaches, Thomas." "What in the hell are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's my land and my business," Thomas replied calmly, though he could feel his temper rising. Sheriff Martinez held up a hand to keep things peaceful. "Now, Thomas, you know there's been orders from the territorial government. All Apache are supposed to report to the reservation. I can't just ignore that." Luna stepped forward, and Thomas was impressed by how dignified she remained even with a dozen hostile men staring at her. "We have committed no crimes, Sheriff. We seek only a place to live in peace." "The place for your kind is on the reservation," Crawford snapped. "Not on decent folks' land." Thomas felt something hot and angry rise up in his chest. "Decent folks? Bill, when's the last time you paid your workers on time? When's the last time you helped someone who was hungry?" Crawford's face turned red. "I don't need lectures from a man who's harboring hostiles on his property." "They're not hostiles," Thomas said firmly. "They're people looking for a better life, same as anyone else." Over the next few days, after the sheriff and his men had reluctantly left with warnings about following the law, Thomas found himself learning more about his unexpected guests than he had ever intended. The confrontation with the townspeople had somehow made him feel protective of the women, and that feeling surprised him. Rosa, the young weaver, had set up her loom near the creek and was working on a new blanket. Thomas found himself watching her work during his breaks. Her fingers moved over the threads with incredible skill, and she hummed softly while she worked. It reminded him of his mother, who used to hum while she did her own sewing. When Rosa noticed him watching, she smiled shyly. "Would you like to learn? It is not just women's work. Many of our men know how to weave." Thomas almost said no automatically, but something made him reconsider. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt to try." Rosa spent an hour teaching him the basic movements. Thomas was clumsy at first, his big fingers struggling with the delicate work. But Rosa was patient and encouraging, and by the end of the lesson he had managed to weave a small section without making any major mistakes. "You have good hands for this," Rosa said approvingly. "With practice you could make beautiful things." Thomas looked down at his calloused, work-worn hands. No one had ever called them good for making beautiful things before. Maria, the healer, had noticed that Thomas often rubbed his lower back after long days of physical work. Without asking permission, she had prepared a salve from desert plants and left it on his porch, with instructions written in careful English. Thomas was skeptical at first, but the pain had been getting worse lately, and the whiskey wasn't helping as much as it used to. He tried the salve that evening, and by morning he felt better than he had in months. "How did you know what plants to use?" he asked Maria when he found her collecting herbs near the creek. "My grandmother taught me and her grandmother taught her," Maria replied. "Each plant has its purpose. This desert seems harsh, but it provides everything we need if we know where to look." She showed him several plants growing right on his own property that he had never paid attention to before. One could reduce fever, another could heal cuts faster, and a third could help with stomach troubles. Elena, the tracker, had proven her skills when 3 of Thomas's cattle had gone missing. Thomas and his ranch hands had spent hours looking for them without success. Elena had studied the ground for just a few minutes before pointing toward a distant canyon. "They went that way," she said confidently. "2 days ago, driven by men on horseback." Thomas was doubtful, but he followed her anyway. Elena moved across the landscape like she was reading a book, pointing out signs that Thomas couldn't even see. Broken twigs, disturbed rocks, faint hoof prints in hard ground. They found the cattle 5 miles away, penned up in a hidden canyon by 2 men who had clearly planned to rebrand them and sell them. The rustlers saw Elena tracking them and fled rather than face charges. Thomas got his cattle back without firing a shot. "How did you learn to track like that?" Thomas asked as they drove the cattle home. Elena smiled. "When you grow up hungry, you learn to follow every animal trail and read every sign. My father taught me that the earth tells us everything we need to know if we listen carefully enough." Carmen had taken one look at Thomas's horses and shaken her head in disappointment. "They are good animals," she told him, "but they could be so much more." She spent hours working with his most difficult horse, a stallion that had always been stubborn and hard to handle. Carmen didn't use a whip or harsh words. Instead, she seemed to communicate with the horse through touch and patience. Within a week, the stallion was following Carmen around like a devoted dog. More importantly, he was responding to commands faster and more reliably than he ever had before. "Animals know when you respect them," Carmen explained to Thomas as she worked. "They will give you everything if you treat them as partners instead of tools." Sophia, the quiet woman who could predict weather, had warned Thomas about a storm 3 days before it arrived. Thomas had been skeptical. The sky was clear and there was no sign of rain. But Sophia insisted, pointing to subtle changes in the way the birds were behaving and the direction of the wind. Thomas decided to trust her and moved his cattle to higher ground. When the flash flood came roaring down the valley 2 days later, his herd was safe while other ranchers lost animals and property. "My grandmother could read the sky like other people read books," Sophia explained. "She taught me to watch for the small signs that come before the big changes." But it was Luna who impressed Thomas the most. Despite being the oldest, she worked as hard as anyone. She cooked meals that were more delicious than anything Thomas had eaten in years. She organized the camp with quiet efficiency. And in the evenings, she would tell stories that made everyone laugh or think or feel inspired. More than that, Luna seemed to understand Thomas in ways that made him uncomfortable. She could tell when he was having a particularly bad day missing Rebecca, and she would find small ways to help without making a big deal about it. A cup of coffee appearing at just the right moment, or a funny story to distract him from his dark thoughts. "You carry your grief like a heavy pack," Luna told him one evening as they sat by the fire. "It is time to set it down for a while and rest." Thomas found himself looking forward to these evening conversations more than he wanted to admit. For the first time in 7 years, he wasn't drinking alone on his porch. Instead, he was part of a group, listening to stories and occasionally sharing his own. The women asked him about his life, his dreams, his plans for the ranch. No one had shown that kind of interest in Thomas as a person in longer than he could remember. They didn't just see him as the boss or the customer or the quiet widower. They saw him as a man with thoughts and feelings worth knowing about. But even as Thomas found himself growing fond of all 6 women, he was troubled by practical concerns. What would happen when the sheriff came back with orders from the territorial government? How could he possibly choose one woman to marry without hurting the others? And what right did he have to disrupt their lives when he wasn't even sure what he wanted? The answer to those questions would come sooner than he expected, and it would force Thomas to make the biggest decision of his life. 3 weeks had passed since the women arrived, and Thomas felt like he was living in a completely different world. His ranch had come alive in ways he never could have imagined. The house that had been silent for 7 years now rang with laughter and conversation. The meals were better, the work got done more efficiently, and even his cattle seemed healthier under the women's care. But with each passing day, Thomas felt the weight of an impossible decision growing heavier on his shoulders. How could he choose just one of these remarkable women without breaking the hearts of the others? And more confusing still, how had he gone from a man who thought love was dead and buried to someone who was falling for 6 different people at the same time? Each woman brought something unique into his life that he hadn't realized he was missing. Rosa's gentle presence reminded him of the simple pleasures he had forgotten. She had repaired all his torn clothes and made new curtains for the windows. But more than that, she had a way of finding beauty in ordinary things. She would point out how the morning light made the mountains look purple, or how the cattle moved like a slow dance across the pasture. Through her eyes, Thomas was seeing his own land as beautiful again instead of just functional. Maria had become essential to his physical well-being in ways that went far beyond her healing salves. She made sure he ate proper meals instead of just coffee and jerky. She had cured his chronic backache and helped him sleep better than he had in years. But she also seemed to understand his emotional pain in ways that made him feel less alone. When he had bad days missing Rebecca, Maria would sit quietly nearby, not trying to fix anything, just being present while he worked through his grief. Elena challenged him in ways that made him feel more alive. She had taught him tracking skills that made him better at managing his own land. When they worked together looking for lost cattle or checking the boundaries of his property, Thomas felt like he was part of a team instead of just giving orders to hired help. Elena treated him as an equal, someone worth learning from and teaching in return. Carmen had transformed his relationship with his animals. Under her guidance, Thomas was learning to communicate with his horses in completely new ways. She had shown him that the partnership between human and animal could be about mutual respect instead of dominance. Working with her made Thomas feel more connected to the natural world that surrounded his ranch. Sophia's quiet wisdom had started to influence how Thomas approached everything in his life. Her ability to read the subtle signs in nature had saved his cattle from floods and helped him prepare for weather that would have caught him off guard. But more than that, her thoughtful way of observing the world was teaching Thomas to pay attention to details he had been missing for years. And Luna. Luna was becoming the heart of this strange new family. She organized their daily routines, settled any small disputes that came up, and somehow made everyone feel valued and important. Thomas found himself seeking her advice about ranch decisions he used to make alone. Her wisdom and experience were helping him see possibilities he had never considered before. But loving all of them created a problem that kept Thomas awake at night. In his world, a man married one woman and stayed faithful to her for life. That was how he had been raised, how he had lived with Rebecca, and what everyone expected of him. The idea of having multiple wives was scandalous enough to destroy his reputation and possibly get him arrested. Even if society would accept such an arrangement, how could it possibly work in practice? Wouldn't the women be jealous of each other? Wouldn't there be fights and hurt feelings and endless complications? Thomas had barely managed to keep one wife happy when he was younger and more energetic. How could he possibly satisfy the needs and expectations of 6 different women? And yet the more time he spent with them, the more Thomas realized that they had already worked out solutions to problems he was just starting to worry about. They functioned as a team in ways that amazed him. When Rosa was busy with her weaving, Maria would take over the cooking without being asked. When Elena was away tracking cattle, Carmen would handle the horse training. They supported each other instead of competing with each other. Thomas had grown up thinking that women were naturally jealous and territorial, especially when it came to men. But these 6 women seemed to genuinely care about each other's happiness and success. They celebrated each other's accomplishments and helped each other through difficulties. It was unlike anything Thomas had ever seen. Still, there was the question of physical intimacy that Thomas barely dared to think about. He had been faithful to Rebecca's memory for 7 years, and the idea of being intimate with anyone else still felt like a betrayal. But beyond that emotional barrier, there were practical concerns. How would such arrangements work? Who would he spend time with and when? How could he be fair to everyone? Luna seemed to sense his worries without him saying anything directly. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she brought up the subject in her careful, diplomatic way. "You are troubled about how this arrangement would work if you accepted our proposal," she said gently. Thomas felt his face get hot with embarrassment. "It's just, I don't understand how 6 women could share one husband without jealousy and fighting." Luna finished for him. Thomas nodded gratefully. Luna smiled. In our traditional culture, such arrangements were rare but not unknown. When times were hard and resources were scarce, sometimes families had to find creative solutions to survive. The key is that everyone must agree willingly, and everyone must be treated with equal respect and affection. She gestured toward the other women, who were engaged in their evening activities around the camp. We have been together through many hardships. We trust each other completely. We want what is best for our family, not just for ourselves as individuals." Rosa looked up from her weaving. "We talked about this many times before we came here," she said. "We know it is unusual, but we also know that together we are stronger than we would be apart." Maria added, "A marriage should be about building something good together. If all of us working with you can build something better than any one of us could alone, then perhaps that is what should happen." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "But what about love? Real love, not just partnership?" Elena spoke up from where she was sharpening her knife. "Love grows from respect and shared experiences. It is not just something that happens to you like lightning. It is something you build together day by day." Carmen nodded in agreement. "We are not asking you to love us all equally from the beginning. We are asking you to give us all a chance to earn your love over time." Sophia, always the most thoughtful, said quietly, "And we are asking you to let yourself love again, even if it looks different from what you had before." Thomas felt tears stinging his eyes. These women understood him better than he understood himself. They saw through his fears and defenses to the lonely man underneath, who was desperate to feel connected to other people again. But even as his heart was opening to the possibility they offered, Thomas knew that the biggest challenges were yet to come. Word of their arrangement was spreading through the territory. Soon there would be pressure from the government, from the church, from his neighbors. People would call him crazy or immoral or both. He might lose business, friends, even his land if the authorities decided he was harboring fugitive Indians. Was he strong enough to stand up to all of that pressure? Was what these women offered worth risking everything he had built over the past 20 years? As Thomas looked around at the 6 faces watching him with hope and patience, he realized that the answer was starting to become clear. For the first time in 7 years, he felt truly alive. For the first time since Rebecca died, he was excited about the future instead of just enduring the present. But before he could make his decision, fate was going to force his hand in a way he never could have expected. The sound of military horses approaching at dawn was like thunder rolling across the desert. Thomas was barely awake when he heard the distinct rhythm of cavalry mounts moving in formation. He jumped out of bed, pulled on his boots and pants, and grabbed his rifle before stepping onto the porch. What he saw made his blood run cold. A full cavalry unit was riding toward his ranch, at least 20 soldiers in blue uniforms led by an officer whose brass buttons gleamed in the morning sunlight. Behind them rode Sheriff Martinez and several men from town, including Bill Crawford with a satisfied smirk on his face. The women heard the horses too and came running from their camp by the creek. Luna reached Thomas first, her face calm but her eyes showing the fear they all felt. "It seems our time of peace is over," she said quietly. The cavalry captain was a tall man with a gray mustache and hard eyes. He dismounted and walked straight up to Thomas's porch without any of the polite greetings that were customary in the territory. "Are you Thomas Walker?" the captain demanded. "I am." "And you are?" "Captain Harrison, Territorial Cavalry. I'm here on orders from the governor to collect these Apache women and transport them to the San Carlos Reservation immediately." Thomas felt his heart start pounding, but he kept his voice steady. "These women are my guests. They're not causing any trouble." Captain Harrison looked at Thomas like he was dealing with a slow child. "Mr. Walker, these are not your guests. These are fugitive Indians who are required by law to report to their assigned reservation. Harboring them makes you an accessory to their crimes." "What crimes?" Thomas asked. "They haven't stolen anything or hurt anyone." Crawford spoke up from behind the soldiers. "The crime of being off the reservation without permission. That's all the crime they need to commit." Thomas looked at the 6 women who had transformed his life over the past month. Rosa was standing close to Maria, both of them trying to look brave but clearly terrified. Elena had positioned herself protectively near the younger women, her hand resting on the knife at her belt. Carmen was holding Sophia's hand, and both women were watching Luna for guidance. Luna herself stood tall and dignified despite facing 20 armed soldiers. She met Captain Harrison's stare without flinching. "Captain," Luna said in her careful English, "we have harmed no one. We seek only to live in peace." "The place for you to live in peace is on the reservation with your own people," Harrison replied coldly. "Now gather your belongings. We leave in 1 hour." Thomas felt something hot and fierce rise up in his chest. For 7 years, he had been dead inside. going through the motions of living without really caring about anything. Now suddenly he had something worth fighting for again. "No," Thomas said firmly. Captain Harrison turned to stare at him. "Excuse me?" I said no. "These women are under my protection as employees of this ranch. They're not going anywhere." The captain's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Mr. Walker, I don't think you understand the seriousness of this situation. I have orders from the territorial governor himself. These Indians will be removed from your property, with or without your cooperation." Thomas stepped down from his porch and stood face to face with the captain. "And I don't think you understand that this is my land, purchased legally and paid for in full. These women are my employees, and I'll be damned if I let you drag them away like criminals." Sheriff Martinez stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. "Thomas, please don't make this harder than it has to be. Just let them go peacefully and there won't be any charges against you." "Charges for what? For giving work to people who needed it? For treating human beings with decency?" Crawford laughed harshly. "Decency? Is that what you call shacking up with a bunch of squaws?" Thomas spun around to face Crawford, his hands clenched into fists. "Bill, if you say one more word about these women, I'm going to knock your teeth down your throat." "That's enough," Captain Harrison shouted. "Mr. Walker, you have exactly 1 minute to step aside, or I'll place you under arrest for interfering with federal orders." Thomas looked around at the faces surrounding him. The soldiers looked ready for trouble. The townspeople were watching with the hungry expressions of people hoping to see their neighbor brought down. Even Sheriff Martinez, who was usually fair, had the resigned look of a man who was just following orders. Then Thomas looked at the women. Rosa was crying silently. Maria was whispering what might have been a prayer. Elena looked like she was preparing to fight even though she was outnumbered 20-1. Carmen and Sophia were holding each other tightly. And Luna was watching Thomas with an expression that said she would understand if he stepped aside to protect himself. But Thomas realized in that moment that he couldn't live with himself if he let these women be dragged away. They had brought life back to his world. They had made him remember what it felt like to care about something beyond mere survival. They had offered him love and partnership and hope for the future. More than that, they were good people who deserved better than to be treated like criminals for the crime of wanting freedom. "Captain," Thomas said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "these women are not going anywhere. This is my land and they are under my protection." Captain Harrison's face darkened. "Then you are under arrest for harboring fugitive Indians and interfering with federal law enforcement." "So be it," Thomas replied. Just then, Miguel and Carlos, his Mexican ranch hands, came riding up from the south pasture, where they had been checking cattle. They took one look at the soldiers and the tense situation and rode straight to Thomas's side. "Boss," Miguel said quietly, "is there trouble?" "These soldiers want to take the women away," Thomas explained. Miguel and Carlos exchanged a look. They had come to respect the Apache women over the past month, and they had seen how much happier their employer had become since their arrival. "That would be a shame, boss," Carlos said calmly. "These women have done good work here." Miguel nodded in agreement. "Very good work. It would be wrong to take them away for no reason." Captain Harrison looked around at the three men facing him and seemed to realize that this wasn't going to be as simple as he had expected. "Are you all willing to be arrested for harboring fugitives?" Miguel shrugged. "If that is what it takes to do the right thing." Carlos spat in the dirt. "I have been arrested for worse reasons." Thomas felt a surge of gratitude toward his loyal workers. They were risking their own freedom to stand with him and the women, but the standoff was far from over. Captain Harrison had orders to follow, and he wasn't the kind of man who backed down easily. The next few hours would determine whether Thomas's newfound family would survive, or whether it would be torn apart by forces beyond their control. "Very well," the captain said grimly. "If that's how you want it, that's how it will be." What happened next would test everything Thomas thought he knew about himself, about justice, and about what it meant to fight for the people you love. The standoff lasted 3 tense days. Captain Harrison had set up camp just outside Thomas's property line, waiting for reinforcements and new orders from the territorial governor. Thomas, the 6 women, and his 2 loyal ranch hands had essentially become prisoners on their own land, surrounded by soldiers but not yet arrested. During those 3 days, something remarkable happened. Word spread throughout the territory about the rancher, who was standing up to the cavalry to protect 6 Apache women. The story grew in the telling, and people began arriving at Thomas's ranch to see what was happening for themselves. Not all the visitors were hostile. Dr. Andrews, the territory's only physician, came to check on everyone's health and stayed to hear their story. He was impressed by Maria's knowledge of herbal medicine and spent hours discussing treatments with her. When he left, he told Captain Harrison that these were not savage Indians, but intelligent, skilled people who deserved better treatment. Father Miguel from the Catholic mission arrived on the second day. He had come expecting to find a sinful situation, but instead found a group of people who were trying to build something good together. Luna spoke with him at length about their situation, and the priest found himself moved by their story. Most surprising of all was Mrs. Henderson from the general store, the same woman who had tried for years to find Thomas a wife. She came with several other women from town, bringing food and supplies. They had expected to find scandal, but instead they found 6 capable women who were working hard and treating everyone with respect. "Thomas," Mrs. Henderson said quietly on the evening of the second day, "I don't pretend to understand all of this, but these women, they're not what I expected." Thomas was sitting on his porch, tired from days of tension and worry. "What did you expect?" Mrs. Henderson looked embarrassed. "I suppose I expected wild, uncivilized people. But that young woman Rosa showed me her weaving, and it's the finest I've ever seen. And Maria helped my daughter with a rash that had been bothering her for weeks. These are good people, Thomas." Similar conversations were happening all around the ranch. People who had come to gawk stayed to listen, and many left with changed opinions about what they had witnessed. But the most important conversation happened on the third evening, when Father Miguel asked to speak privately with Thomas and Luna. "I've been thinking about your situation," the priest said carefully. "The law says these women must go to the reservation, but there might be another way to approach this." Thomas looked up with interest. "What do you mean?" Father Miguel chose his words carefully. "If one of these women were your legal wife, she would have the right to remain on your property. And as her family members, the others might be able to stay as well, at least temporarily." Luna nodded thoughtfully. "We had considered this possibility, but we are all committed to staying together. We would not want to force Thomas to choose one of us over the others." "What if you didn't have to choose?" Father Miguel asked. "What if there was a way to create a legal arrangement that protected all of you, while respecting the laws of both the territory and the church?" Thomas frowned. "I don't understand." The priest explained his idea. Thomas could legally marry one of the women in a Christian ceremony. The other women could be officially registered as employees, family members, and household staff. It wouldn't be the ideal solution, but it would provide legal protection for all of them. But which woman would be the legal wife? Thomas asked. Luna smiled. "We discussed this among ourselves yesterday. We believe Maria should be your legal wife." Thomas looked surprised. "Why Maria?" "She is the right age, not too young and not too old," Rosa explained. "She has the healing skills that make her valuable to the community. And she has the gentle nature that people will accept in a rancher's wife." Maria blushed but nodded her agreement. "I would be honored to be your wife in the eyes of the law, but in our hearts we would all be your family." Thomas felt overwhelmed by their generosity and wisdom. They had found a solution that he never could have imagined on his own. Father Miguel nodded approvingly. "This arrangement would satisfy the legal requirements and provide protection for all of you. It's unconventional, but these are unconventional times." The next morning, Thomas walked out to face Captain Harrison with a new confidence. "Captain, I'd like to propose a solution that might satisfy everyone." Thomas began. Harrison looked skeptical. "I'm listening. I'm going to marry one of these women today in a legal Christian ceremony. The others will remain as family members and employees. That makes them all legal residents of my property." Captain Harrison frowned. "That's not what my orders specified." Sheriff Martinez stepped forward. "Actually, Captain, if one of them is his legal wife and the others are family members, they would have the right to remain here. The law is pretty clear about that." Thomas held his breath while Captain Harrison considered this. The officer was clearly frustrated, but he also seemed relieved to have found a way out of the standoff that wouldn't result in bloodshed or a lot of paperwork. "Fine," Harrison said finally, "but I want to see a legal marriage certificate. And I want documentation that the others are legitimate employees or family members." "You'll have it," Thomas promised. That afternoon, Father Miguel performed the wedding ceremony on Thomas's front porch. Maria wore a beautiful dress that Rosa had been secretly sewing for 3 days. Luna braided flowers from the desert into her hair. Elena, Carmen, and Sofia stood as witnesses, along with Miguel, Carlos, and several people from town who had come to support them. Thomas had been nervous about the ceremony, worried that it would feel like a betrayal of Rebecca's memory. But as he looked into Maria's kind eyes and spoke the vows, he realized that this wasn't about replacing his first wife. This was about creating something new, something that honored the love he had learned from Rebecca while opening his heart to new possibilities. Maria's vows, which she spoke in both English and Apache, brought tears to many eyes. She promised to be a good wife, a good partner in building their ranch, and a good sister to the other women who would share their life. When Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, the small crowd cheered. Captain Harrison, who had watched the ceremony with grudging respect, shook Thomas's hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Walker. I hope you know what you're doing." Thomas looked around at his new family, his legal wife, Maria, Luna, who had become like a mother to all of them, Rosa with her gentle artistry, Elena with her fierce loyalty, Carmen with her gift for working with animals, and Sofia with her quiet wisdom. "I'm starting to figure it out, Captain. I'm starting to figure it out." As the cavalry rode away and the visitors from town began to head home, Thomas realized that his life had changed completely from what it had been just a month ago. He was no longer the lonely widower who had given up on love. He was now the head of an unusual but loving family, a man with responsibilities and joys he had never imagined. The real adventure was just beginning. 5 years had passed since that wedding day on the porch, and Thomas Walker's ranch had become something he never could have imagined when he was a lonely widower drinking whiskey alone every night. As he stood on that same porch now, watching the sunrise paint the desert sky in brilliant colors, he marveled at how completely his world had transformed. The ranch itself had grown from a simple cattle operation into a thriving enterprise that was known throughout the Arizona territory. Thomas now ran nearly 4,000 head of cattle across expanded grazing land. But that was just part of the story. Rosa's weaving had become so famous that wealthy ladies from as far away as San Francisco would send orders for her blankets and rugs. She had trained 3 local women in her techniques, creating jobs and bringing money into the community. Her work was displayed in the finest homes in Phoenix and Tucson, and she had even received an order from a collector in New York City. Maria's healing practice had grown beyond anything Thomas could have expected. People traveled for days to seek her help with illnesses and injuries that regular doctors couldn't cure. She had written down her knowledge of desert plants and their uses, creating the first comprehensive guide to southwestern herbal medicine. Dr. Andrews had helped her publish the book, and it was being used by doctors throughout the territory. Elena's tracking and security skills had made her invaluable to law enforcement throughout the region. The territorial rangers regularly hired her to track cattle rustlers, horse thieves, and even the occasional escaped prisoner. She had never failed to find her target, and her reputation had spread far beyond their local area. The governor himself had written her a letter of commendation for her service to the territory. Carmen's horse training methods had revolutionized how people in the region worked with their animals. Cavalry officers came to study her techniques, and horses trained by Carmen were sought after by ranchers, lawmen, and even circuses. She had started a small breeding program that was producing some of the finest horses in the Southwest. Sofia's weather prediction abilities had saved countless lives and prevented enormous property losses. Ranchers, farmers, and even railroad companies consulted with her before making important decisions. She had started keeping detailed weather records that were being studied by scientists back east, who were trying to understand climate patterns in the desert. Luna, now in her 60s, had become the unofficial matriarch of their extended community. People came to her for advice on everything from family disputes to business decisions. She had helped arrange marriages, mediated conflicts between neighbors, and provided guidance to young people who were struggling to find their way in life. But the most remarkable change was in Thomas himself. The bitter, lonely man who had given up on happiness was gone, replaced by someone who woke up each morning excited about the day ahead. He had learned that love didn't have to look like what he had experienced with Rebecca. Love could be bigger, more complex, and more generous than he had ever imagined. His relationship with Maria as his legal wife had grown into something deep and comfortable. They had been blessed with 2 children, a daughter named Anna who was now 3 years old and a son named David who had just turned 1. Maria was a devoted mother and a partner who understood both the emotional and practical sides of their unusual family structure. But Thomas had also developed meaningful relationships with each of the other women. Rosa had become his creative partner, helping him see beauty in their desert world and teaching him that there was more to life than just practical concerns. Elena was his adventure companion, someone who challenged him to be braver and more daring than he had ever been before. Carmen had taught him to approach life with the same patience and respect he now showed to his horses. And Sophia had become his spiritual advisor, helping him understand his place in the larger patterns of nature and life. Luna remained the wise counselor who helped all of them navigate the complexities of their arrangement. She had become the grandmother figure that Thomas's children adored, and she provided the stability that held their unconventional family together. The arrangement had not always been easy. There had been moments of jealousy, misunderstandings, and practical difficulties that they had to work through together, but they had learned to communicate openly, to support each other through challenges, and to celebrate each other's successes without resentment. The community's acceptance had been gradual, but genuine. People who had initially been scandalized by their arrangement had come to see the positive impact the family was having on the entire region. Their ranch had become a symbol of cooperation between different cultures, and their success had proven that unconventional approaches could work when they were based on mutual respect and genuine care. Thomas often thought about Rebecca during these years, but the pain of her loss had transformed into something different. He still loved her and honored her memory, but he no longer felt guilty about finding happiness again. He had come to understand that Rebecca would have wanted him to live fully, to love generously, and to be the best man he could be. The children were growing up trilingual, speaking English, Spanish, and Apache with equal fluency. They were learning skills from all their aunts and developing into confident, capable individuals who saw diversity as a strength rather than a source of division. Anna was already showing Rosa's artistic talents, while David seemed to have inherited Elena's fearless curiosity about the world. As Thomas stood on his porch that morning, watching Maria hang laundry while Rosa worked at her loom and Elena prepared to ride out to check the cattle, he reflected on how wrong he had been about love and family. He had thought that loving one person completely was the highest form of human connection, but he had learned that the heart could expand to hold much more than he had ever imagined. Their success had attracted attention from people who wanted to understand how their arrangement worked. Writers and scholars had visited the ranch to study their family structure. Some came expecting to find chaos or immorality, but they usually left impressed by the harmony and productivity they witnessed. A reporter from a Denver newspaper had written, "What I found at the Walker Ranch was not the scandalous situation I had been led to expect, but rather a model of cooperation, hard work, and mutual respect that puts many traditional families to shame." The children were proof that their arrangement was working. Anna and David were happy, healthy, and well-adjusted. They had multiple mother figures who loved them, a father who was present and engaged, and an extended family that provided security and support. They were growing up with a broad understanding of the world and deep respect for different cultures and ways of life. Thomas had also discovered talents in himself that he never knew existed. Rosa had taught him to appreciate art and beauty. Maria had shown him how to be more patient and nurturing. Elena had helped him become more adventurous and confident. Carmen had taught him about the spiritual connection between humans and animals. Sophia had opened his mind to deeper ways of understanding the natural world. And Luna had shown him how to be a wise leader who brought out the best in other people. As the years passed, their ranch had become a destination for people seeking a different way of life. Young couples who were struggling in traditional marriages came to see how they managed their relationships. Families dealing with cultural differences came for advice on bridging divides. Even government officials and religious leaders visited to understand how their community had achieved such remarkable success. Thomas knew that their story was unusual, and he didn't expect other people to follow their exact path. But he hoped that their example might inspire others to think more broadly about what love and family could look like. He had learned that happiness came not from following society's rules, but from having the courage to create arrangements that honored everyone's needs and dreams. Standing on his porch as the sun climbed higher in the desert sky, Thomas Walker smiled at the sound of children's laughter from the house behind him, and the gentle voices of the women who had saved his life in ways he was still discovering. The lonely rancher who had thought love was over had instead found that love was just beginning to show him its true possibilities. His story had become proof that sometimes the best families are not the ones you're born into or the ones that society expects you to create, but the ones you choose to build with people who see the best in you and help you become the person you were always meant to be.